After the ratification of the Constitution, there were challenges to the new republic. The objectives for this lecture are: be able to describe the divisions between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. They're also sometimes referred to as the Republican Party, but for the purposes of this lecture, I'm going to refer to them as the Democratic Republicans, and each party's viewpoint. Be able to describe challenges to freedom and citizenship, federalism and the Marshall Court, westward expansion, and the effects of the War of 1812. The political players were George Washington, who was the first president, John Adams, who was the first vice president, Thomas Jefferson, first Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton, first head of the Treasury Department, and the Supreme Court, which had 6 members, and the Chief Justice was John Jay. During the 1790s, there was a lot of political fervor. Americans became more politically active. They were having meetings, reading pamphlets, reading newspapers. You will see the growth of the press and the establishment of the post office. And the establishment of the post office encouraged personal letters, and often those letters were political in nature. And there was a jockeying over who would have power in the legislature, executive branch, and the judiciary. The Anti-Federalists will morph into the Democratic Republican Party. Thomas Jefferson was a Democratic Republican. Democratic Republicans included small farmers, shopkeepers, and laborers. Democratic Republicans believed in the decency of the common man. They believed in direct democracy. They sought greater protection of individual rights. They wanted stronger state governments at the expense of the federal government. They wanted frequent elections and smaller districts. And they viewed elites as corrupt. Divisions between the Federalist and the Democratic Republican parties began over Hamilton's financial program and deepened because of the French Revolution. Hamilton wanted America to be a major commercial and military power. His plan included paying off existing national debts, which were supported by bonds at face value. He also wanted to pay off the debts of the states. Hamilton wanted to create a new national debt to replace the old national debt. And the new national debt would include self-interest-bearing bonds to creditors. And these are bonds that only the wealthy could afford. Hamilton wanted to create a Bank of the United States, which was a private corporation. And that bank held public funds, issue banknotes, make loans to the government, and provide profits to stockholders. He wanted to tax whiskey in order to raise revenue. He also wanted to implement a tariff. A tariff is basically a tax on imported foreign goods and government subsidies to encourage the development of factories, to make things at home instead of buying them abroad. He also wanted to create a standing army. The Democratic Republicans, Jefferson and Madison, and you'll notice Madison was a former Federalist. He later moved over to the Democratic Republican Party. They were against Hamilton's plan. They believed that the goal for America should be a westward expansion and ties with Europe. That was their vision for America. They wanted independent farmers marketing grain, tobacco, etc. They worried that Hamilton's plan was a threat to liberty, that a standing army was a threat to freedom. They worried about his idea for the national debt. They feared that speculators would make money off this new national debt. They worried that a national bank would enrich the wealthy at the expense of ordinary Americans. And Jefferson believed that the Constitution didn't state that Congress had the power to create a bank. They also believed that the whiskey tax hurt farmers. Farmers distilled their grains into whiskey because it was easier for them to transport their whiskey to market. The French Revolution deepened the divide between political parties. I'm not going to say much about the French Revolution other than to say it occurred in 1793. It was a war between France and Britain, and during this war, King Louis XVI was executed. During this war, Britain seized American ships who were trading with the French West Indies, and the British impressed or kidnapped American sailors and placed them into the British Navy to fight in the French and British War. John Jay, who represented America, signed a treaty with Britain. It was called John Jay's Treaty. And in that treaty, Britain left their outpost on the western frontier. In exchange, America guaranteed favored treatment of British imported goods. And it didn't get rid of the impressment of American sailors. John Jay's treaty was significant because it inspired the formation of political parties and it deepened the divide of the political parties. And the political parties I'm talking about are the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists supported Washington's administration and Hamilton's economic program and close connection with Britain. Federalists included merchants, farmers, lawyers, and non-Southern elitists. They believed in social hierarchy. They believed that public office was for the wealthy and highborn, and they worried about anarchy. They thought that the Democratic Republicans were anarchists. The Democratic Republicans were supporters of Madison and Jefferson, and they were supportive of France. They believed in self-government. They included wealthy Southern planters and ordinary farmers. They believed in social and economic equality and thought the Federalists were monarchist and were a British style of aristocracy. So bottom line is this. The Federalists supported Britain and were against the French Revolution. They thought that was anarchist. The Democratic Republicans were supporters of France and did believe in the French Revolution and their cause. I'm going to discuss the challenges to the new American Republic by discussing the presidencies of John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison. First, John Adams. John Adams was a Federalist, and he was the second president of the United States. During the Adams presidency, there will be a crisis of freedom. In fact, this is the significance of John Adams' presidency. During his presidency, there was the XYZ affair. During the XYZ affair, U.S. was trading with both France and Britain, and both countries had seized ships. The U.S. tried to negotiate with France, but France wanted U.S. bribes. This French scheme was made public and titled the XYZ Affair for the French officials that did the bribery scheme. As a result of this bribery scheme, the U.S. and France got into a quasi-war in 1798. Ultimately, Adams made peace. The XYZ Affair led to the Naturalization Act. And the Naturalization Act extended the residency requirement for immigrants to obtain American citizenship from 5 to 14 years. So it made us weary of foreigners. It made us weary of immigrants. The XYZ affair also led to the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798. In fact, this was the greatest crisis for Adams. The Alien Act allowed the deportation of persons from abroad deemed dangerous by federal authorities. And the Sedition Act authorized the prosecution of any public assembly or publication critical to the American government. 18 people were charged with sedition, and 10 were convicted. The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions were brought forth by Jefferson and Madison. And those resolutions said that the Sedition Act was unconstitutional and a violation of the First Amendment. But no other state adopted it. And of course, the resolutions were correct. They were a violation of the First Amendment. Next, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was elected in 1800. He and Aaron Burr had tied during the election, and the House of Representatives chose him as the new president. He was a constitutional constructionist, meaning that he believed in the original language of the Constitution. Someone who is not a constitutional constructionist believes that the Constitution is a living and breathing document, that the Constitution adapts to different societies over time. During Thomas Jefferson's presidency, judicial review will be established. And judicial review was the result of a Supreme Court case called Marbury v. Madison in 1803. Prior to Marbury v. Madison, the Supreme Court didn't have a lot of power. Their jurisdiction came under Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution. It said that the court had original jurisdiction over certain types of cases and lawsuits between two or more states or cases involving ambassadors and other public ministers. The court also had appellate jurisdiction. It also handled cases involving treaties and maritime law, which involved ships and navigable waterways. But that all changed after Marbury v. Madison, because Marbury v. Madison established judicial review. So what happened was, on the eve of leaving, John Adams, the second president, appointed a number of justices of the peace for the District of Columbia. James Madison, who was Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of State, refused to issue those justices' commissions. They were called the midnight judges, meaning Adams appointed him at midnight before he left office. 4 of those judges sued for their offices, and one of them was Marbury. John Marshall, who was the Chief Justice at the time, declared a section of the Judiciary Act of 1799 that allowed courts to order executive officials to deliver judges' commissions. In other words, what he said was that Madison didn't have to deliver those commissions. That, in other words, it exceeded the power of the Congress and was void. Marbury was entitled to the commissions, but the court couldn't order Madison to execute those commissions. So judicial review adds a check to the judiciary of the legislative branch, meaning Congress can make laws, but the Supreme Court can rule those laws unconstitutional. Jefferson's greatest achievement was the Louisiana Purchase which he purchased in 1803. And the importance of the Louisiana Purchase was that it doubled the size of America and it ended France's presence in America. And it will also eventually create an issue regarding slavery. We'll talk about this more during the semester. But the reason it creates an issue with slavery is because the Louisiana Purchase creates more territory, and there's nothing in the Constitution that says whether that territory is going to be free territory or whether it's going to be slave territory. So it will ultimately fuel the debate over slavery. So this is the land that was purchased from Napoleon, Louisiana Territory, extended up to Canada and down to the Gulf of Mexico. Finally, the James Madison presidency. Madison was a Democratic Republican like Jefferson. And the major challenge to the new American Republic during his presidency was the War of 1812. The significance of the War of 1812 was that it was the first time that the U.S. had declared war on another country, and that country was Britain. America had been dealing with Indian conflicts and squabbles with Britain. There will be thousands of American settlers moving west. And there was a call by Tecumseh to revive traditional Indian culture and resist federal policies. Indians should stop buying American alcohol, clothing, food, and manufactured goods. Tecumseh called for a tax on American frontier settlements. But America put those uprisings by the Indians down. The causes of the War of 1812 were, one, attacks on American shipping by the British. They were still doing that. And two, British was encouraging Tecumseh's attacks on American settlements. So the War of 1812 was a two-front war. It was a war on Britain, and it was a war on Indians. Britain had defeated France, so it had turned its attention to America. Some Indians sided with the British, including Tecumseh, and some assimilated Indians, meaning they had assimilated into American culture, sided with the U.S. Andrew Jackson will be a war hero during the War of 1812. He fought off Cherokees and Creeks and defeated them. And then Jackson fought off the British who had invaded New Orleans. So the War of 1812 ended with the Treaty of Ghent. And the Treaty of Ghent basically said there was no exchange of territory or agreement regarding the impressments of American sailors, and there was no agreement on having neutral shipping rights. So the effects of the War of 1812 were that Britain and the Indians posed no more threats to the Louisiana territory, and that the war contributed to the end of the Federalist Party, because the war heroes, such as Andrew Jackson, will be a Democratic Republican. So after this, there will only be a one political party system, which will be the Democratic Republicans. Okay, this ends the lecture. Please let me know if you have any questions.